Hi, I'm Sarah Gollist, Associate Professor at the University of Minnesota and also Associate Director of the IRL program. And I'm here with Christina Roberto, who's an Assistant Professor of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the University of Pennsylvania. So Christina, you've described a model of strategic science that, in your words, is creating a policy bridge to get research evidence to decision makers at the right time. And this is exactly what fellows in the IRL program are supposed to do. This is really the goal of the program, is to use research as a vehicle to make change in communities to build a culture of health. So I think it would be really helpful to hear a little more details about a specific example of how when you put your strategic science model into action and how it worked.
Sure, yeah, so I've been doing this work now for several years, and I can think of a good example actually back when I was training in graduate school. At that time I was at the Rudd Center for Food Policy and Obesity, and I was training with Kelly Brownell, who's really developed this model and kind of this approach to research. And we had an interesting opportunity, which I think is a nice example, where there was basically a front-of-package nutrition labeling initiative. My research area is in obesity and food policy. And so there was this idea, which was a good one in principle, that different stakeholders, so people from industry and academics and advocates, they were all kind of coming together to come up with a way to communicate nutrition information to customers. So they came up with a symbol, a little front-of-package label that was called Smart Choices. Mm-hmm. And it was going to appear on thousands of food products that basically met a threshold for a healthy choice. So again, in principle, this seems like a great idea. So this rolls out in August 2009. And when it rolls out, some of the products that it's on fudgesicles, and it's on Hellmann's mayonnaise and some sugary cereals. And
so Hellmann's mayonnaise was a healthy choice?
Was a smart choice, a smart choice, right. So, if you just look at a couple of those products, you're kind of, a little skeptical of this. And so a few things happened. We thought, one, this is potentially a really important opportunity for strategic science, because we could bring some rigor and some science to really evaluate this program relatively quickly. Mm-hmm. So what happens is that program had a website. They put the different products up on the website, and so we could randomly sample from that site. We could see the different products that were smart choices and apply a nutrition standard to them, sort of evaluate how nutritious they actually were. Yeah. And when we did that, we found that 64% of the products would not actually meet an objective threshold for a nutritious product, right? So, and we ended up publishing that paper, but in traditional science, sort of do that and get that out through an academic channel and be done with it, and you move on to the next one. Yeah. But we weren't doing this sort of traditional approach, right? We were at the Rudd Center, was really committed to this work. And so Kelly had put a few things in motion. One, he had reached out to Dick Blumenthal, who at the time was the state attorney general. He went on to be the state senator. And he really cared, Dick Blumenthal cared about these issues, and he was interested in sort of raising, some attention to this program. In addition, the FDA, independent of us, also sent a kind of we were watching letter, sort of alerted the program that they were concerned. Also, Kelly had been in touch. The New York Times wrote this sort of scathing piece on it, and other media outlets also picked up on this. And Kelly had talked to them, sort of being the research change agent, kind of give them some information too from a scientific perspective. And they sort of wrote these articles, Fruit Loops for your health, what's going on here. Now, we had this little bit of data on this, right? And so we were able to connect with Dick Blumenthal and say, look, if you're going after this program, we've got some science to suggest it's not just a couple of products. It's actually systematically not a good thing for public health. And so in a matter of months, really amazing thing happened where you had the confluence of a few really important forces. The media came out and said, look, this is potentially problematic. The FDA was working on this. You had this public health champion in Dick Blumenthal, and you had Kelly and a team of researchers that had led that Smart Choices work share some data to say, look, you do have a case here from a scientific perspective. The outcome was pretty incredible in that threat of legal investigation led to the halting of the program. Yeah. And so they stopped and it didn't end up getting, full-blown rolled out and on all these products. And so I consider it a huge public health victory. And there were obviously a lot of different players, but I think it's a nice example of strategic science.
Yeah. So what might have happened if you had taken a different course instead of connecting with Dick Blumenthal and the sort of policymaker team, but had just approached it as a traditional applied researcher? What might have happened, or how do you think the story would have played out differently?
Yeah, right. So it's entirely possible that the story plays out the same, that Dick Blumenthal came out and that it would still be seen as a problematic program. So that's entirely possible. But I think having research to support that helped make the case, and everyone felt like they had stronger legs to stand on, and it really brought a kind of weight to the issue.
Or if you had done the study but on the wrong timeline, then the science wouldn't have been available.
Right, exactly. And so that required, it's a good example where I dropped everything. And my colleague Marie Bragg was on the study. I think we stayed up and entered data for 2 nights on all the products. And we actually we gave them that information before it was published. So I think one lesson there was we could have also done that and just said, oh, okay, it's over, there was this public health victory and we're not going to publish it. But after the fact, we were able to turn it into a publication and use it as a good example. So I think you can meet both goals.
Yeah, good story. So I want to hear a little bit more about your views about who are the relevant change agents for your strategic science model. I like the framing of change agents because I think when I think about the research to policy process, I think of the end user or the final audience only being policymakers. And that can be a little limiting to some researchers and community groups who might not think of their work as having a direct influence like you described, sort of that decision maker who comes in and there's a decision that needs to be made or a program that needs to be halted where it's a policy decision at the moment, rather than sort of a broader view of the policymaking process, which allows for all the sorts of policy influences from the way that a certain social problem is framed all the way to a decision. And so I think that using the word change agent allows for a broader view of what counts and what type of researchers and what type of research problems might be relevant. Can you talk a little bit more about other types of change agents that might play a role in any experiences in maybe some of your later research where you've worked not just with a policymaker with a capital P, but other types of groups?
Yeah, absolutely. So I totally agree. The selection of the words change agent is, we thought about that, right? Because it's not just an elected official who's making policy. And I think it really varies depending on the issue that you're working on. So when I'm approaching a research question, I do try to think about who are the players in this space, who's making policy, who's influencing it. And depending on the issue and where the issue is currently at, it can really vary who it makes the most sense to connect with. And also, who's available, who's willing, who's interested. And so, I was just telling that story with the smart choices. In that case, I think the media served a role as one change agent, right? And I think people don't typically think of the media in that way, but obviously they have an enormous influence. Dick Blumenthal in the story I was just telling, he represented like a legal authority, right? But there are issues where, we're reaching out to the FDA because they're working on regulations and we might have a small bit of science that can be informative. There are times, I think, like you said, we think about policy with big P, but there's little p, right? So reaching out to people at institutions, at companies. I would consider, someone at a company making company-wide policy a change agent. Community groups, NGOs. So I think it's important to keep this definition really broad and think about it based on the issue you're working on and who the relevant players are.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So one major theme in the broader literature on how best to disseminate evidence and how evidence is used in policymaking and has already come up in our conversation today is the importance of relationships and really building trusted relationships. I think that a lot of traditional researchers may not have the aptitude or inclination to devote the time and effort it takes to building relationships. And it really isn't easy. And it's above and beyond what we typically do. Particularly in academic institutions. So can you give an example of how you have forged those relationships? Like personally as a researcher?
Sure. I think there's two issues at play. I think you're right that for some people, they're just going to self-select into this work. That, they're just people who are not interested in doing this kind of policy work, which is totally fine. And we need a whole range of different kinds of science out there. But I also think there's a structural issue where we're not necessarily incentivized as scientists to spend the time doing that. And so I think, part of what I hope to see in future years is, and I do think some of that's changing, where institutions are starting to reward and recognize people who are spending time developing those relationships, going to testify, or participating in the policy process. And then you're right, relationships are critical to this kind of work. Now, I was really lucky when I was training as a graduate student because I was embedded in a center working with people like Kelly Brownell and Marlene Schwartz and people who had already spent a lot of time cultivating relationships, and so they could open doors for me. Now I'm in a place where I don't have this broad network, and I certainly have some of these relationships, but the burden is more on me to try to build those. But I think I think there's a few ways to do that. One, reaching out, which seems kind of obvious, but I talk to a lot of scholars who feel like, well, I don't know how to meet people making policy, and emails, phone calls, great place to start. Yeah. People are not going to respond, but that's okay. The ones who do are probably the ones where you're going to have the most traction with anyway. And I think explaining to them that you're committed to this kind of work, you wanna hear their thoughts. I think even that opens up possibilities. I think a lot of researchers, when they're having these conversations, go in and say, look, I have data and you should use it, and why aren't you using these data to make policy? As opposed to, I realize that you have a lot of experience in this and I have a lot to learn from you. And I think that helps open up the conversation.
So emphasizing that two-way flow of information, that you want to learn from them. You don't think you have the answers to provide to them, because I think that can create more hostility rather than a right. relationship building.
Absolutely.
Context.
And it's tricky because as scientists, we're supposed to be the experts, right? Mm-hmm. And we're really trained to try to project that. And so I think it's kind of stepping out of that traditional role of we should have the answers and being open to others' perspectives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm curious how you think about the change agent, or the sort of the audience you have in mind for the research, or the co-creator of the questions. How much are they involved throughout the process? Because this question's coming out of, there's a spectrum of levels of community engaged research. Fellows in the IRL program are participating with community. Communities are part of our research leaders themselves, and that's a very, it's a sort of similar to the community-based participatory research model. But at the same time, you've talked about strategic science more around the front end, asking the questions, and then the dissemination. So I'm curious about what role your change agents have played in that middle process, in the scientific inquiry, and the collecting data, analyzing data.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, and it's one that I've tried to answer in my own work on a case-by-case basis. And I think it really matters who that change agent is, and can also matter the question that you're asking. So one big issue that emerges here is conflicts of interest, right?
Yeah.
And we usually think about that with interesting funding something, but if you're partnered with anyone and they're in the policy world and they have a perspective on something, you're always going to be worried about introducing bias into your science. And first and foremost, if you're doing this work, you're a scientist, right? And so I've really thought about this depending on who the change agent is. Most of the time you're having an initial conversation, you're getting some insights, but then I'm going off independently, designing the study, doing all the data analysis, and that person's just not involved in that process. And I think for many situations that's good and appropriate, and is often how I try to do things. But there are situations where you'll miss out if the person is not engaged throughout more of it. So a good example is I'm working right now with the Department of Public Health in Philadelphia, and they have really savvy, research-oriented people at the department who are dedicated to carrying out evaluation work there. They know the ins and outs of the city. They have a lot of insight into data sets we can use and making connections. And I think we'd lose out if they weren't more involved in the study design. I think it's good to specify up front and make sure there's a commitment and everyone understands no matter what we find, we're publishing it. And so some of those conversations, I think having them early on, when you feel like there are people invested in the outcome, it's important to lay out that as a scientist, you're committed to that, and that's what'll happen.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Do you have a formal contract or any kind of? Have you ever put a process in place to have all partners sort of sign on, and that this is the plan? You will publish the results, whether they show what you maybe would like it to show, or if it's null, or if it's opposite, or it's more agreement.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I know people have done those kinds of contracts when working with companies. I personally have not felt like I had to, and it's not been an issue as long as there's a verbal agreement, or we've documented some notes and some commitments on paper, but I've not forced anyone to sign anything, and it's so far all been okay.
Yeah. Okay. Great. One, I think, issue once you have that close relationship is the person that you trust and can take action on your science might want that science earlier than you can provide it, whether that's because of the length of time it takes just to do good, solid research that you can be proud of, is getting close to the answer to your question, and also because of the publication delays that you talked about. So can you talk about a specific issue where this timing issue came up?
Yes, the timing issue is a big one, and I do think sort of broadly that journals are aware of it. I feel like the very top tier journals, JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, more of these journals are offering rapid response publication. So I think from a kind of structural level, people are trying to figure out how to deal with this. But that's not always the case, and often the policy timescale is quicker than the research publication.
Quicker even than the most rapid review.
Yes. So I can give you one example very early on in my career when I started doing this work, and it's something I've thought a lot about since then. So this story is about a policy to put calorie labels on restaurant menus, which was something that advocates had actually talked about for a while, but New York City, this was back in 2006, introduced this idea, and it seemed pretty viable, like it could actually happen there. And again, so this was back when I was at the Rudd Center, and I was working with Kelly and others there. And we basically were in a situation where when I went to the research literature, there was very little out there on the impact of menu labeling. But this policy was moving forward, and there was also some interest at the national level to do something like this. And we thought, okay, well, we have to get some data on it. And we didn't have a lot of time, given what was percolating in New York. So we created a kind of restaurant lab, and we thought, well, we could have a rigorous controlled study. It's a lab study, but we can make it have real world elements. Yeah. So, we brought people into the lab and we randomized them to get different menus, and they were having dinner with us. So they come in, and some people get a menu with calorie labels, some people get a menu without calorie labels. And then we had this third condition where we said, okay, if you give people this calorie information on menus, but they don't know what it means, it might not be terribly helpful. Yeah. So we put this statement on the menu that said, an average adult should have 2,000 calories a day. And the study turned up an interesting finding where basically we were seeing that people in our research were ordering fewer calories at dinner. But when they had calorie labels on the menu, they were going home and they were eating more, sort of wiping out the effect. But in this other condition where we had put that 2,000 calorie statement on the menu, it wasn't happening. Right? So there seemed to be something useful about putting it in context that wasn't necessarily affecting them at dinner, it was affecting them later. Yeah. Okay, so we've got this finding, and it's one study, and it's a lab study, and as scientists we know there's all sorts of limitations to this. That being said, it's some of the only data that are out there. The timing was such that Kelly was actually going down to testify on this issue in Congress. And there were lots of logical reasons to do menu labeling, sort of irrespective of what the data said, right? Just in terms of a consumers have the right to know argument. But he has this great story where the paper's under review, but it's not published yet. And he sort of pulls some of the various policymakers aside, and he's drawing on napkins or bar graphs and saying, look, there might be something really valuable about this contextual statement, something to consider, right? At the end of the day, that idea to put some sort of contextual information gets written into the actual federal law, right? When it ends up being a national law. Well, it has not rolled out yet, but it's supposed to, at least by the end of 2018, supposedly. So when you step back and think about this, on the one hand, you're thinking, well, it's just one study, right? And there's all these limitations. It's not published yet. But on the other hand, we had thought through and said, look, we had theoretical reasons to think that this would be effective. There are other studies that suggest something like that would work. We have some data to suggest it'd be helpful. There's not really an indication that it'd be harmful. Right. And at some point, you're never going to have perfect data. And at some point with policy, you have to try things out and then evaluate them in the real world and make adjustments later. Sure. So that's one example of that sort of timeliness issue.
Yeah. So you're a relatively junior faculty member working with a research modality that's not very well established yet. Although it is related to kind of other types of community-engaged research modalities which are gaining traction. So have you faced any pushbacks or challenges from other researchers in the research community?
Yeah, I mean, for the most part, I think this approach has been, well received and people get excited about it. I do think it's important to clarify, and usually when I get pushback, it's around this issue of what is meant by strategic, right? And so I think it's important to clarify that we're being strategic in the questions we're asking. We're not being strategic in the answers we're generating, right? And so that's really, really important. My number one job is to be a scientist, to do good, rigorous work, to remain objective. And so I think that's just important to clarify that we're essentially having conversations with people, getting good ideas for how to make something policy relevant, but we're agnostic as to what that answer is going to be. And that's different. The change agents that we work with sometimes are not. Agnostic. They do have a stake in it, but I have the luxury of being a scientist and not having to worry about that part of it.
And what about the other side? Sort of, have you faced any pushback from policymakers or advocates who, don't like what you're doing or don't want the research or don't see the value in the evidence?
Yeah, from my experience, I think if you're talking to policymakers and influencers and you say, "Hi, I'm a scientist and I would love to help you. I'd love to do timely research and get you answers that you want," it's very well received. And the ones, it's not universally well received, but there's a self-selection here, right? So probably the ones who wouldn't be keen on it are not sending the email back or not, responding.
Okay.
And so we're really finding people who see value in doing this.
Yeah. Okay, that's excellent. So a related question to what you're talking about with asking strategic questions that policymakers care about and not giving strategic answers comes from just a sort of big issue in this whole area of research about navigating the line between the demands of scientific objectivity and the realities and the subjectivity that comes from having these embedded relationships and working within communities and having goals. Like, we have goals. We want to make the world a better place. We want to promote population health and public health. So how do you navigate that tension, that desire for objectivity and the sort of actual realities of having, policy goals that you share and certainly that your change agents who you're working with have?
Yeah, no, it's an enormously important issue, and there is a tension there. A few thoughts. I mean, I do think there are some people who say, scientists should not be advocates for different policies. In some ways I agree in that, but in some ways I think it's important to think about what that really means. So in my mind, if there is a bunch of data and it's really good evidence and it suggests that some policies are better than others or that there's a better way to do a policy, I personally really want scientists more than other people to stand up and say, look, we have data on this. Let's use the data to inform what we're doing. So in that sense, if that's how you're thinking about a scientist as an advocate, then I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think most scientists would hope that we're engaged in that as opposed to other people who don't have data, who are just kind of giving opinions about it. But there are other times where I think as a scientist, you have to think about if you produce one study, we're always needing to think about it in the context of a body of research, right? And so I think it's important when we're trying to translate research to policy that we are educating policymakers about the limitations and the caveats of what we're doing.
And the other studies that may have come up with an opposite conclusion.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, this has happened with menu labeling, and I actually feel proud about this, right? I have a study that has positive effects. I'm on another paper that's about to come out with null effects, and I think you've got to be committed as a scientist, because really what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure it out. We're trying to figure out what makes sense. And I don't have a horse in the race. I want us to be able to fix public health issues.
Yeah. I want to give you a chance to share any other stories about maybe an example when the strategic science process didn't work out for you or for the partners that you're working with.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I don't think there's been any sort of utter failures of it, but
there probably will be.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Failure is part of the learning process.
Oh, absolutely. But in some ways, it's nice because really all it is you really are trying to ask scientifically interesting and relevant questions, and as a scientist, and I think it's good for people thinking about doing this work, I do set out with the goal of publishing whatever I'm doing, and so usually there's some positive that might come out of it. So either I've learned a whole bunch from someone, I usually am able to publish the work, but there have been rocky periods to navigate, and I'm still learning myself. So, for example, there's an issue where basically a couple of states have introduced bills to put warning labels on sugary drinks, and California is one of them. And this is another example where there's reason to think that this might be a good idea, but there's almost no data on it, right? So I was connected and got some funding to do some work, and I was talking to the California Center for Public Health Advocacy, and they have a terrific team there is very committed to public health research. And I wanted to study this issue. I do food labeling, so it's right in my wheelhouse. It's timely. It's sort of a perfect blend of things for me. And when I first come up with the design, I have these grand, sort of interesting scientific questions where I think, okay, I want to study warning labels, and I want to study graphic labels and all these different kinds that would bring in all this theoretical research around generating emotion and storytelling, And so I cook up this study, and I'm really excited about it. And then I talk to the California Center for Public Health Advocacy. And they say, that's great, but it's absolutely not what we need right now. What we need right now is a study of these text warning labels that we've proposed. Because that's what's feasible. The graphic stuff, maybe that'll happen in the future. It's not going to happen now, right?
So they wanted you to scale back.
Right, exactly.
Bring it back down to the policy reality that they could envision.
Exactly. And that conversation ended up being really valuable because what came out of it is we decided to meet in the middle. I could test different versions of text labels that were psychologically interesting to me, right? I could use theory and inform that, but I could give them really practical data that they needed to literally write this bill and write what this label should say. And it doesn't mean, I can tell you right now, I'm doing the graphic studies, right? So it doesn't mean I've decided not to pursue that because they told me it wasn't what they needed now. Like we've got that underway. But it meant I did a slight shift to give them the data they needed, within the year.
Yeah.
And that ended up being really, valuable. And we were able, because Robert Wood Johnson Foundation actually funded that study in a rapid way, we were able to get data out in time for various hearings. And that being said, the policy failed. It's not moved forward yet.
Yeah.
It might in the future, but it's not like.
But that's a sort of negative policy outcome, but not a scientific outcome.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's how I saw it. And it's generated a whole bunch of other interesting ideas that we're pursuing now.
Yeah. Well, great. I guess just wondering if you have any kind of last words of advice for participants in the IRL program who are similarly invested in doing research to make change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I do think there are challenges to doing this work, but I find it extremely fulfilling, and I think it's just enormously beneficial to engage in these conversations. I feel like it's enhanced the scientific work. I've gotten to talk to really interesting people, have interesting perspectives, have insights that I wouldn't otherwise have. There are some challenges to navigating all the issues you came up with, but at the end of the day, I think it's well worth it. It makes the science better, and I feel like I'm engaged in really meaningful research, and that sustains me on a personal level.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for talking with me and all of us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thanks.